In this video, we're going to look at the process to create a model from an imported image. On the screen, you can see at the top the image of the fish, and at the bottom you can see the model that we're going to create. The first part of this is to create a 3D texture component derived directly from the image. Then we use the image as a base to draw vector outlines, which are then used to create a simple model of a fish. The texture component is then combined with our simple shapes in order to make the finished model that you can see. The image for this example was originally a painting, but a photo of sufficient quality could also be used. Let's begin by starting a new copy of Aspire. So click on the icon to create a new file, and for this job I'm going to set up a width of 12, height of 4, Z0 at the top of the block, material thickness set to 0.75, date and position in the lower left corner, units in inches, modelling resolution set to high, and hit OK. I'm going to come up and click on the icon here to tile the windows horizontally so we can see the 2D view at the top and the 3D view at the bottom. The model we're going to create is going to be based on an imported image. We could go ahead and use the standard import bitmap for tracing icon here if we were just planning to use it to help us to sketch vectors that we were then going to use with the modelling tools. But what I'd like to do is actually create a component directly from the bitmap that will be part of our modelling process. The best way to do that to ensure the highest quality is to come down to the modelling tab and click on the icon specifically to create a component from a selected bitmap. If we don't already have a bitmap selected in the program when we click on this, then it will just open a window allowing us to browse the PC and import an image in order to create that new component. Here from the project folder I'm going to select a file rainbow trout _US FWS and hit open. Now we can see in the 2D view that we've got a grayscale preview of our component. We can see in the component tree we have a component added that had the file name, and we can see in the 3D view that we've got this component that is essentially a texture based on the light and dark areas of our imported image. We're going to use this later on in our modelling process, but for the moment what I'd like to do is select the grayscale, click on the icon here to set the selected object size. I'm going to change the height to 4, we've got the anchor set to the centre and link XY checked, and hit apply and close, and then with that still selected I'm going to click on the align selected objects icon and then click on the middle one at the top here to align that in the middle of our work area. Now what I'd like to do is sketch the vectors over our grayscale preview here that will represent the basic shapes that we need for our fish. Then later on we'll overlay this texture on top of those shapes. So let's maximize the 2D view while we're drawing our vectors. I'm going to come down to the drawing tab, and you'll see if I just deselect the grayscale here how much it fades, and that won't make it very easy for me to sketch the vectors I need over it when it's not selected. So what I'm going to do is select the grayscale, going to right mouse click, and you'll see there's an option here that says Object Properties. If we click on that, then this will allow me to adjust how much the grayscale will fade when it's not selected, and I'm going to actually put it down to about 10% and hit close, and now it's pretty clear for me to see the outlines even when the grayscale is not selected to allow me to sketch my vectors. You need to have an idea of the type of modelling tools you plan to use before you can start drawing your vectors. In this case, for the fish, I would like to use a 2-rail sweep for the body and the tail, and then the Create Shape tool for things like the eye and the fins. So for the body and tail, I'm going to need a set of drive rails and some cross sections, and then for the fins and the eye, I'm going to need some closed vectors. If I'm sketching closed vectors, depending on the shape, I may be able to use some of the standard options that we have. So for the eye, I may be able to use something like the ellipse here, assuming it's not perfectly round, and then I can just zoom in there using the mouse wheel, click in the middle and just drag a vector that sits around the edge of that object within the grayscale. We hit close now. Let's just scroll down and look at a fin. For a more complex shape like this, I could create a simple shape and edit it, or I can use something like the polyline tool, and then I would just sketch nodes, clicking with the mouse around the outside of the shape that I wanted to create, right mouse click to finish, then I would select that, go into node editing, I'll hit N on the keyboard, the shortcut key to do that, and then I can just grab some of those nodes, hit S in order to smooth them, so S is the shortcut key to smooth them. You can also access those functions through the right hand mouse click menu, and then I can just use the handles in here in order to adjust that to get it to follow the shape of the outside of the fin. Let's just click back on select mode, and we'll just come up and click to zoom to fit again. So I'd continue doing that process for all of my fins around the part here, and also I'd draw a shape for the gill line. For the 2-rail sweep, what I would do is I would click the option to draw a curve here, and then I would start just off the front and then click my way along in order to create a curve like that, right mouse click to finish, N to go into node editing on there, and then I'll just make sure that that was slightly outside of the edge of the fish's body. I'm also going to need to have a vector drawn that represents the silhouette of the fish as well, cutting in at the mouth and following the overall shape and around the tail as well. So that gives you the general idea of how we'd start to construct the vectors for this, and depending on your proficiency with the vector drawing and editing tools, this may take anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour for an example like this. But the vector setup is very important because the quality of the vectors is going to directly influence the quality of your 3D model. In this case, we want to focus on the modelling, so I'm going to jump ahead now and open a file. If you wanted to though, you could pause the video while you went ahead and created all the relevant vectors you'd need for this example yourself. Here though, we're going to open a file which is on the disk. I'm going to click on the open button, and we're going to choose the file here, Rainbow Trout Vectors, and hit open. I'm not going to save that one. And when we open this, you can see quite clearly some of the shapes that we'd already started creating and some of the additional shapes that we've created here, such as the silhouette vector and then a different vector for each of the fins. And at this point, we're actually ready to start the modelling process. So let's click on the icon here to tile the windows so we can see the 2D and 3D view. I'm going to come down to the modelling tab, and I'm going to switch off our component that we've already created, the one that we generated when we imported the image. Then I'm going to come to the Layers tab, and you can see we've organised our vectors onto different layers. I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to call this Components, and then we'll click to accept that. I'm just going to move that to the very top of the list and make sure it's selected so that it's currently active. What this is going to do is provide us with a layer where all the grayscales that we create as we model each of our components can be placed, which will make it very easy for us to switch that on and off, but also to still see all the vectors that are on layers that are below that one. So with that done and this one active, I'm going to switch off the outlines layer for a moment, so we just leave it so we can see the vectors on the 2-rail sweep body layer. I'm going to click on the Modelling tab. I'm going to go into the 2-rail sweep function. Just click on the icon there. I'm going to select this rail. I'm going to hold Shift down on the keyboard and select this rail. Click on the button to use selection, and then I'm going to select this vector here as my first cross section, and I'm going to click here in order to add that across my 2 rails. Then I'm going to add a second copy of this cross section around about 2/3 of the way along the fish, and click. So now we've got the round cross section here, the round cross section here, and also at the end of the tail. But for the tail, I'd actually like it to transition down into this flatter cross section. So I'm going to select this, and first I'm going to click here at the part where the body transitions into the tail to add that cross section, and then I'm going to click on the end cross section here to change that one. So now we should see the first cross section, the round one with the red node here and here, and the second cross section with this yellow node here and here. I'm going to make sure that scale cross section with width is checked. I'm going to give this a name, so we'll call this fish body, combine mode set to add, and hit apply. Now we can see in the 3D view the type of shape that's created, so we can see how it's transitioning up and down into the round cross section and then flattening off to go into the tail where we added this flatter cross section here. If I'm happy with that, I can hit close. Now I'm going to click on the layers tab. I'm going to undraw the 2-rail sweep body layers and switch on the outline layer, which we're going to use to create all the rest of our parts. Make sure components is still my active layer though. I'm going to click back on the modeling tab, and what I want to do is take that shape that we swept and just crop that back to the actual outline of the fish. So I'm going to select the grayscale there, and then I'm going to hold shift down and select this vector here, which represents the outline. You may need to zoom in to make sure you're selecting the right one. We can see now that selected vector highlighted by the dashed line. So we've selected grayscale first, vector second. Now we can come over and click on the icon here, which will clear the area of the selected component outside of the selected vector. So there we can see we've just cropped that back, and we've cut in shapes like the mouth and the tail here in order to give us the correct size and shape for that particular component. Quite often within a spire you'll find that you sometimes need to model a larger, more simple shape like we did there using the 2-rail sweep, and then use another vector in order to crop that back. Now we can start to create our other components, and these are all going to be made using the Create Shape tool. Let's start by clicking on the icon to create shape from vectors. I'm going to select the vector for the eye here, and I'm going to make this have a fairly high profile. I'm going to push this all the way up to around 90 degrees. I'm going to set the base height to 0 for this. I'm going to scale that. I want to scale it though. I don't want it to be so bulbous, so I'm going to enter a value of 0.05. So we've got a nice sharp edge shape there that's coming up, and then it's flattening off to create this kind of button profile. So around 90 degrees, scale to height 0.05. Call that component I and hit apply. Next I'm going to click on the Start New Component button, and this time I want to create a component here, and what I want this to do is just give me a line that's going to accentuate the gill part of the fish here. So what I'm going to do is actually create a very, very shallow shape. So I'm going to put in an angle of 5 degrees, no limit on it. I'm going to hit apply, and then what I want to do to create this wedge shape on the other end of this is to use the tilt function. So I'm going to click tilt, I'm going to click on the set anchor button. I'm going to click around the nose of the fish here to pick the point that's going to stay on the modeling plane, and then I'm going to click just past the right hand side here to click the point that's going to be raised up when we tilt this. The default value for that is 10 degrees, so we can see that's put a huge wedge underneath there. I just want quite a small amount, so I'm going to set this down to around 1 degree. Now we can see that's just coming up, and it's just giving me this little step shape on the back part of the head there. So let's call that gill. I'm going to hit apply and close, and now what I'm going to do is a little bit of sculpting, because the gill doesn't go all the way from the bottom of the body here to the top. This top part here actually blends into the top of the fish. So first I'm going to take that component we just created, I'm going to hold shift down and select the grayscale for the body, and then I'm going to choose the icon that we used before to clear the area of the selected component. So we're basically taking our first component and using the second component in order to crop it back. So we've cropped that shape back to the outline. Next I'm going to deselect by clicking in the background of the list here. I'm going to select that gill component there, and I'm actually going to use the sculpting tools in order to blend the top part into the body. So I'm going to come up with that selected, click on the sculpting icon, and I'm going to uncheck the preserve transparency because I do want to blend out the edge here. I'm going to choose the smooth tool. I'm going to set the diameter around about 100 in this case, fairly high strengths in the, around 50, 60, something like that. We'll leave the smoothness setting set to around 70 there, and I'm just first of all just going to come around here and smooth the edge there. So we've just gone all over those edges. Next I'm going to come up to the top part here, and I'm going to much more heavily smooth that by rubbing the cursor back and forth. When I'm happy with how smooth that is, then we can just hit OK. And now we can see how that smoothed that and blending it into the top part of the body there, but how we've still got the line for the gill coming down into the chin. Of course, we've now smudged and smoothed rather all that edge here, so what we want to do is select that component grayscale again, hold shift down and select this component grayscale for the body, and use the crop function once again to clear that area in order to cut that back. So there you can see how we created a hard edge but used the sculpting tools in order to smooth and blend that top edge in. If you wanted to, you could go in and smudge and smooth that as much as you like until you are happy with the transition between those shapes. In this case, I think that looks okay though. Now we're going to work round all the fins in our design. So I'm going to select the create shape again. I'm going to select this vector here. I'm going to enter an angle of 30 degrees in this case. I'm going to give this a base height of 0.05. So if we set this to merge and we'll call this fin 1 and hit apply, we can see that's just blending into the body there. But what I need this to do is come up so that it blends into the body at this point here. So again, we're going to come back to the tilt function. I'm going to check that on. I'm going to click set anchor, and for this shape I'm going to click around this point here to keep that on the modeling plane and click up around here in order to create my tilt. We can see the 10-degree default has actually done quite a good job in that case. If we wanted to, you could increase that a little in order to get that to raise up. But what we don't want, if we zoom in here, is too hard an edge at this point here, because that we do want to blend into the body of the fish. So maybe we'll actually just bring that down again. So around 10 degrees, that looks good for that particular one. If I'm happy with that, then I can click on the Start New Component button. We'll click on this small one here, and I'm going to set this to be 30 degrees, base height of 0.5. Let's just go ahead and hit apply, and we can see that actually looks okay. That's just making a raised shape. That would be a fin that's sort of underneath the fish, so I don't need it to break the silhouette of the body of the fish here. So we'll just give that a name, fin 2, and then click the button to start new component. Next, we'll select this vector here, and we'll take the same parameters, 30 degrees, base height 0.5, set it to merge, call this one fin 3, and hit apply. And we can see that again we're going to need to tilt this up a little bit to get it to overlap the bottom part of the body here. So I'm going to click on the tilt, click on set anchor, and I'm going to go from sort of the bottom here and then slightly tilting to the right and up, and there we can see that is a little too much. If we look closely, we can see we're getting a wedge shape in there. You may have to rotate the model around a little sometimes to see this, so let's just reduce that down. So that's gone a little too far now, 6 degrees, so take a look at that. Sometimes it might be easier to maximize the 3D view while we're doing this. You can see that doesn't look too bad there, so I'm happy with that. Let's go up to view, tile windows horizontal. Next we click on start new component again. This time we'll select this vector here. Again we'll take 30 degrees, base height 0.05, call this fin 4, hit apply, and I can see for the size of this that's probably adding a little too much curvature. I don't want these fins to be very curved, so I'm going to change the angle to 20 degrees. I'm also going to reduce the base height here maybe to 0.03, so it kind of drops down below the back line of the fish here, and then we can tilt that up, and we'll click here and here. That's obviously too much, so I'll just keep toning that down. That's a little too much there. Go with something like that, around 4 degrees there. Next, click Start New Component again. Select this shape at the top here. We'll go back to 30 degrees. Go with a base height of 0.03. Call this fin 5. Hit apply. And I'm actually going to reduce that down a little as well. So that's just going to blend into the back there. Then click Start New Component, and we'll come to the main fin at the top here. We'll leave 20 degrees for this. I'm going to set the base height at 0.05. We'll call this fin 6. Hit Apply. I can see that doesn't look too bad. Maybe 20 degrees is a bit much. We'll put that down to 15. And that's just blending into the back of the fish there. So I'm happy with the way that looks. And at this point we can go ahead and hit close because we've created all the shapes that we need for the basic version of our model. Now let's click in the white space to unselect the vector there, and what I'd like to do is just generally smooth and sculpt all these components that we just created here before we go ahead and combine them with the component we created that has the texture from the image. So I'm going to select the fish body component from the component tree, shift and select the last one in the list there, so we select all of these. I'm going to click on the icon to group the selected objects, so we now have a single component group, and I'm going to make a duplicate copy of this so we can keep this as a safe copy. That means that when we start smoothing and sculpting and we bake all these components together, that we'll still have a version that we could go back to if we wanted to individually edit any of those components again. So I'm going to right mouse click on this, choose the duplicate option from the drop down menu. I'm going to undraw the first one, I'm going to right mouse click on that's name and choose the rename option, and we'll call that Fish Original Shapes. Then for the second one here, we'll right mouse click on that and rename that and call that Fish Edit. Now I'm going to select that component group. I'm going to come up and click on the icon to apply smoothing filter. Software warns me that it's now going to bake these together as a single component, which is why we've just created that safe copy to work with. So hit OK. And here we're just going to generally smooth this. I'm going to leave preserve transparency set because I don't want to blur the edge of my part into the background. And we're going to set this around halfway. So you can see that's just smoothed out a lot of the lines that we had in there, started to blend together some of these seams that we've got for the fins. We're going to finish that off with the sculpting. If I'm happy with that, I can hit OK. Now I'm going to select that same component. I'm going to come up and click on the sculpting icon, and this time with the smooth selected, I'm going to set the diameter fairly small, around about 40 there, set the strength around about 50, and you can zoom in if you want to make sure you're being very accurate with this, but here I'm just going to smooth over the point where the fin meets the body there, and I'm going to do the same with this one, just blur that point there so we don't get too harsh of a transition line, and we'll do the same for this as well. So just rub back and forward till we're happy with the way that looks. You can make any other edits you want to at this stage as well. If you wanted to cut the mouth in further, you could smooth any other areas or smudge any other areas, then that would be possible. Once I'm happy with those changes, I'm going to hit OK. And at this point we've completed what I've been referring to as our basic fish model. Now this in itself could be something you could cut, you could create toolpaths on a machine in order to create a nice simple fish model. Here though, what I'd like to do is add a lot of detail to this by using the component we created from the original image and overlaying that over the top of these 3D shapes that we've created using the modeling tools. Now before we combine the shapes, let's just take a look again at the component that was created when we imported the image at the start of this example. We'll undraw this one that we've just been working on. We'll switch on the top component in the list, Rainbow Trout. Again, you can see in the 2D view the grayscale that we used in order to draw our vectors. That's the 2D representative of the 3D component that you can see in the 3D view at the bottom here. Let's just maximize the 3D view and take a closer look at this. The first thing you can see is there's a lot of speckling or noise in the image, and that's very typical of digital images unless they've been generated in a graphics program and saved in a very high quality format. So one thing we'll need to do with this is to smooth it. The second thing is the software's automatically scaled the height of this, with the light areas being high and the dark areas being low. So we'll also want to check the Z-scale of it before we go and overlay it over our part. First of all, let's go ahead and smooth it and get rid of some of this noise. So we need to select the component. I'm going to come up, click on the icon to apply smoothing filter. And in this case, I'm just going to apply around about halfway along. So we'll just use the slider about halfway along and hit OK. And you can see that that's drastically removed or reduced the amount of speckles and noise that we had in the part and just started to blend together some of these shapes. In addition, we want to adjust the height of this. So I'm going to click on the icon to change the properties, and I'm going to change the shape height for this to be 0.05 and hit the space bar in order to get that to update. When we're overlaying a texture over other 3D shapes, we normally don't need it to have a very high Z value, because it's going to take a lot of its shape from the ones that it's going to effectively be added to. So if I'm happy with that, we can hit close. Let's come back up and click on the icon to tile the windows again so we can see the 2D and the 3D view. Now let's switch back on the shapes we created, the simple shapes, and we can see those two being added together now are giving us quite a nice result, but we've still got part of the image component which is outside of the fish, so we need to crop that back. So what we want to do is select the component we want to crop, which is the one called Rainbow Trout. Then I'm going to hold the control key down and select a second component, the fish edit baked model, that's going to act as our cookie cutter, going to act as the shape that it's going to be cropped back to. So this one first, this one second, and then we're going to click on the icon here to clear the area out of the first component that isn't inside the area of the second one. And then we can see all that extraneous materials now disappeared, and the result we're looking at in the 3D view is our texture, which is just being overlaid over the top of all those 3D shapes we created using the vectors and the modeling tools. And you can see that that gives you a very nice result in this case. The quality of the component you create when you import an image is going to depend a lot on the image itself. If the image is low resolution, then that's probably not going to give you a very good component. Also, if the image has a lot of shadowing or highlights, very light or very dark areas, then when they translate into the Z heights of the component, then that also will probably not give you something which is going to be very useful as this kind of texture component as we've got here. A good way to check an image is before you start the modelling process to import it into a session of Aspire, roughly size and scale it, do the smoothing passes on it and see what it looks like. If it looks okay there, then you should be able to use it as we have here, or you may be able to use the sculpting tools in order to tidy it up or smooth or smudge areas together, or it may be that it's just not good enough quality that it's going to create any kind of useful texture for a part that you can machine. That's definitely a good thing to check though before you go through the whole process of creating all your vectors and all your other components. So that almost concludes this example. Let's take a moment to summarize some of the things we've looked at. We started by setting up a job and then directly creating a component from an imported image. We then used a grayscale for that component to give you an example of how we would start to create the vectors we'd need for the modelling part of the process. To shortcut that, we loaded a file where we'd already created all the vectors and then worked through the different modelling tools, starting with the 2-rail sweep for the body and tail of the fish, cropping that back to the outline vector, and then using the create shape tool in order to create the eye, the gill and all the different fins. Along the way we showed you how you could use the sculpting and smoothing tools in order to get those different components to blend together. Once we'd completed the basic form using the modelling tools, then we went back to the component we'd created from the image. We smoothed and scaled that and then show you how that could be added with the set of basic shapes that we'd made in order to create the finished model of the fish that you can see here. This is a very useful process for creating detailed models in a relatively short amount of time, but it does completely rely on your image being one that converts well to a component when it's imported into Aspire. Before we finish now, let's just save a copy of our file. Go up to File, Save As, and in the project folder here, I'm going to overwrite the one called Rainbow Trout Model, And so if you want, you could open that up from the project folder there and take a look at the file at this point. And that concludes this video.